Alrighty. Hello everyone, my name is Nicole and I'm one of the diabetes dietitians from Perth Children's Hospital. So I'm just following on from today from Lara's presentation, and we're going to be covering managing meal rises, which is from the Advanced Pump Workshop. So bear with me, some of the information in this particular slide is similar to what has been covered in the CGM workshop. So for some of you, this may just be some really helpful revision. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to talk about insulin action and the timing of insulin delivery, the accuracy of carb counting and its importance. We'll be discussing some snacking, the effect of food types on blood glucose levels, and what our CGM can show us, managing meal rises in the context of GI, glycemic load, and also fats and protein and the impact that they have. Alright, so insulin action. So rapid-acting insulin, for example, Novorapid or Humalog, begins to act around 10 to 15 minutes after a pump delivers the insulin. So the maximum effect of a before-meal food bolus can be around 1 to 1.5 hours. However, insulin action can last up to 3 to 5 hours in the body. So there may not be enough insulin available to actually cover some of the food types, and what you therefore end up with is what we call a delayed meal rise. So both the timing of and how you deliver your insulin is really important in how we manage our meal rises. Okay, so what this is meant to show you is a pictorial representation of how accurate we actually need to be when we're talking about our carbohydrate counting. So you can see in the top picture there that the noodle stir fry with chicken has about 31 grams of carbohydrates, and the photo on the bottom left is about 42 grams and bottom right is about 21 grams. So in terms of accuracy, we always aim to be within at least 10 grams of carbohydrates so a variability range of about 10 grams, and we know that if it's roughly about that, then generally it won't have a significant impact on the blood glucose levels if you were to give the same amount of insulin. However, if you have smaller children, so for example 5 years or younger, that difference that they can tolerate in carbohydrates and accuracy should be ideally closer to about 5 grams. Otherwise you might find that it does start to impact their blood glucose level if the insulin isn't correctly matched up to the amount of carbohydrates in the meal. So this is just another picture to show you. So for example, a 20-gram difference does start to have quite a significant impact on the blood glucose levels if you're being inaccurate. And for example, if you were to give 20 grams less than what you had bolused for, and the blood glucose, if you were to eat 20 grams less carbohydrates than the insulin that was bolused for, you might find that the blood glucose levels do tend to drop because there is too much insulin circulating in the body, but it would only happen around an hour, hour and a half after actually consuming the meal. Therefore, there isn't an actual rush to manage that hypo. All right, so this is just to remind you, oops, once we get everything up there, this is just meant to remind you that it's really important on a regular basis that you actually remeasure the amount of carbohydrates that your child or yourself is eating within a day, particularly if they're really commonly consumed foods, like you have the same breakfast cereal, or you eat the same 2 pieces of bread for lunch, or the same wrap for lunch, because brands might change the ingredients in their recipe or the quantities, and also you might find that as you grow, your child grows, the amount that they're actually putting into their bowl is actually increasing. And if you were to always just assume the carbohydrate content was the same and therefore you gave the same amount of insulin, you might find that blood glucose levels aren't actually coming back to within target range as we would like for them to be 2 to 3 hours after a meal. So just to remind you, as children grow and quantities change really quite quickly, it's important to essentially recalibrate and make sure that you're remeasuring the carbohydrates in regularly consumed foods. All right, timing of insulin delivery. So this is just a image to show you a sensor trace. So as you can see in green, you've got the blood glucose levels target range running from left to right, and then the black line there is a trace of the blood glucose levels over the day. You'll see 4 small green triangles on the bottom of the trace there, and they are actually indicating food boluses that have been given on the trace. So the important point to take away from this particular slide is the fact that you can see with the 2 purple ovals there, with the first oval, those blood glucose levels have already started to rise up, and the triangle is part the way into that blood glucose level rise, as opposed to the second circle where the insulin bolus has been given prior to actually consuming the meal containing the carbohydrates. And as a result, you can see at around 9 o'clock there was about 86 grams of carbohydrates consumed, which is a heavier carbohydrate load than what was consumed at 1:20. However, because the timing of the insulin delivery is much more appropriate, where thereby it was given, say, 10 to 15 meals before the person started to eat the meal, the insulin is better able to manage that rise in the blood glucose levels. So the timing of the insulin is really, really key as a basic principle to managing blood glucose levels. And if that timing is out, it will certainly have an impact on meal rises and blood glucose levels as well. All right, so some discussion points from this particular picture. You can see a copy of a logbook in the background, and in the purple section you can see the carbohydrate content and the insulin given, and also the blood glucose levels there as well. So what we can take away from this is, just from doing standalone finger pricks, you can see that the blood glucose levels are actually within range as we would like them to be. However, when you move down to the picture below, you'll see that on the trace there are actually some meal rises, and certainly if you were to have taken a finger prick at a slightly different point in time, you'd see that the blood glucose levels are actually outside of that target range. So it's really important to take home that what is happening behind the scenes isn't necessarily always witnessed, but it doesn't mean that it's not happening, and there's certain ways that we can manage that. Now, if you have a CGM, obviously you are able to have the tools in your toolbox to be able to witness what's happening a little bit better behind the scenes in a continuum, as opposed to a standalone one point in time with a finger prick. So what we're going to talk about now is the causes of the meal rise. So why is this actually happening? For example, on the CGM trace, why are those blood glucose levels spiking in the way that they are? All right, so glycemic index, hopefully not a new principle for anyone, but we will just recap it anyhow. So it's basically the ranking of carbohydrate-containing foods between 0 and 100 based on how much they raise the blood glucose levels in the 2 hours after eating compared to a reference food. And in this instance, our reference food is glucose. So you can see that a lower glycemic index food, which is visually shown in the yellow-orange colour, is a much flatter curve and is taking place over a longer period of time. So low GI foods break down slower, therefore the blood glucose levels rise at a slower pace and come back to baseline within a couple of hours. Now, with high glycemic index food, which are typically food that tend to have higher sugar content, lower fibre content, and often more refined and processed, not always, but often, there is a much more rapid rise in blood glucose levels and a much higher rise, and then blood glucose levels come back down to target a lot quicker. And in actual fact, this picture is showing that they go below that target range, so to have a bit of a hypo at the end there. Okay, so having a look at high GI versus low GI carbohydrates. So high GI carbohydrates, or gushes, are really quickly digested carbohydrates. So basically it's like giving food to, or energy or petrol to the body that is really easily broken down. The body doesn't have to put in much hard work with that digestive or absorptive process, and therefore it's a much quicker process for the blood glucose levels to start to rise. What also happens with the high GI foods is that there is a rapid release or gush of after meal glucose into the GI system, and you can see in that picture there that the glucose is moving out at a higher point of the intestine, as opposed to, it's closer to the stomach as opposed to lower on in the smaller intestine. So if you're a numbers person, the GI values that are typically considered to be high GI are 70 or above, keeping in mind in Australia we don't have glycaemic index values on our food labels, but it is something that you're able to get from different resources, in particular the glycaemic index website through the Monash University is quite helpful. Okay, so on the other hand now, having a look at our low GI carbohydrates, or our tricklers, they're very slowly digested. That process of absorption into the body out of the GI tract tends to happen at a much lower portion of the small intestine, and it produces a slow gradual release or trickle of the glucose after the meal, and the GI values are on the lower side of the 0 to 100, so 0 to 55 rather. Okay, so having a look at this GI diagram again, ideally we want to try and keep a meal rise to 4 millimoles or less from baseline. Now, I don't want you to feel that if there is a meal rise above that, that it is a food that cannot be consumed by you or your child, but rather I'm going to help you have a better understanding of why that meal rise occurs and how we can manipulate other factors in the meal or to do with your insulin management to assist with curbing that meal rise there. So the other parameters that you might want to work with so you've got three really. You've got the fact that we want to try and keep the meal rise to 4 millimoles from baseline or below, aiming for at the top end, and once again, in an ideal world, this is certainly not always going to happen. What we're looking for is what is actually happening with the blood glucose levels for the majority of the time, not all of the time. There's always going to be factors that mean that the blood glucose levels go outside of the parameters that I'm mentioning to you. But another consideration is aiming for 10 millimoles roughly or less for the majority of the day, or that the blood glucose levels are coming back to within target range of between 4 and 8 millimoles about 2 to 3 hours after a meal. Okay, so just moving on to some quality carbohydrate switches. So rather than being worried at the meal rises from carbohydrate containing meals and snacks, and also possibly then running the risk of wanting to remove all carbohydrates or a lot more carbohydrates from your diet, one thing that we can actually do is to change the glycemic index of the carbohydrates that are being contained in the meal. So for example, rather than having a piece of white bread, you could change that to a piece of multi-grain bread. So the carbohydrate content itself may still be fairly similar. However, the glycemic index means that the lower the glycemic index, the lower the meal rise, which in essence is going to be better for the management of diabetes in the long term. So having some other points to consider, sorry, just before I forget to mention them, is that the reason it's really important for children in particular to still have carbohydrates in the diet is because we need carbohydrates to grow. Children also need carbohydrates to help with their brain function and also red blood cell function, and just to give them energy to concentrate and learn during the day. So So we don't want the people to be removing the carbohydrates necessarily as a result of having a meal rise, but rather let's see what we can do to manage that meal rise itself. So some tips about the GI of foods that can be found are also in the GI handout, which we will make available to you either via email, or if you're listening in today and you don't have it at home with you, you can call triage and we can send that out to you as well. So some things that you can do to reduce the GI is by increasing some soluble fibre content into your meal. So that might be adding in some psyllium, adding in some oats, adding in some legumes. You can also add acidity to a meal. So that might look like adding in some balsamic vinegar to as a salad dressing, or adding in a squeeze of lemon juice or lime juice if you've got something like a stir fry. So add that extra component there to lower the GI of the meal. Choosing foods where starch is less available to digestive enzymes. So for example, light and fluffier rices that are harder to break down, such as basmati rice or dungra rice. You can also add in some extra protein. So it might be, if you're having a fruit salad, adding in a little bit of low-fat unsweetened yogurt, for example. You can also add in a healthy fat to the carbohydrates. So for example, some nuts and seeds, avocado, olive oil. So really focusing in on those monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids, as opposed to saturated and trans fats, which we know aren't particularly good for our heart or our cholesterol. So some examples here, as you can see in the picture. In the first one at the top, basic swap is, or switch, is that the cornflakes have been switched out for some porridge or a natural muesli, and you can see that the berries have been added in there as well. So the berries will assist in adding in a little bit of fibre to help lower the GI, but they're also a really low carbohydrate, so you can have them in there to assist with satiety and filling up hungry tummies without having to add in extra large amounts of insulin to cover that. In the middle there, you'll see that the short grain rice, like jasmine, which is a very high GI rice, has been switched out for a dungra, or another long grain option, for example, could be basmati. Now, in the bottom, you will see that a regular white potato has been switched out for a sweet potato, but some other potato varieties that are quite helpful as well could be the Nadine, the Almara, the Charisma, or even corn as another option there. Okay, so what does our CGM show us about food? What you can see is happening in these two particular traces is that on the left-hand side, there is a significant spike that is seen in the red circle on the left-hand side that is not visible on the right-hand side. And that's because the blood glucose levels are showing what is actually happening following eating a high GI meal as opposed to a low GI meal. So let me get some information up there now. On the left-hand side, that particular person has consumed some regular corn thins, which have a high GI of about 87. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see that the trace is showing what's happening to blood glucose levels after consuming some Rivita pumpkin seeds. So a much lower glycaemic index option of 46 grams, therefore harder for the body to break down, a slower release of those tricklers that I mentioned earlier, and subsequently barely a blip in a meal rise there, a really tiny meal rise that can be seen on the right hand side. So a much better carbohydrate choice, nice low GI choice. All right, so glycemic load, I'm just going to touch on this but move over it quite quickly, but it's just another tool to pop in your toolkit to help with your understanding of managing meal rises for those that are wanting that extra element there. So GL is a measurement of how high a blood glucose level will rise after eating a specific amount of a specific carbohydrate. Now this is this is compared with your glycemic index, which is more to do with the speed at which those rises are happening. So it brings together the quality of the carbohydrate, so that's the GI like I've been mentioning, and the quantity of the carbohydrate portion into one solitary number. So please don't get too concerned with the maths. However, if you are a maths person, then obviously this equation is here for you to use. But what you can see is that the glycemic load is considered to be on the lower end if it's roughly under 10, and higher glycemic loads means less of a meal rise there. So the lower the glycemic load, the better, because it's less of a meal rise. So what you can take home from this point here is that if you were to eat the same amount of carbohydrate on your plate, and I'll show you this slide here, aiming to have a quarter of the plate being made up of a low glycemic index carbohydrate. So if we were to be talking about the same quantity of carbohydrate, but we are going to choose a better quality of carbohydrate, so for example a sweet potato versus a potato or corn, a sweet potato or corn instead of a regular white potato, or a long grain rice like dungra or basmati over a jasmine rice, you'll find that the glycemic load is going to be better, and therefore the blood glucose levels will be better as well. Okay. As I mentioned, aiming for a quarter of the plate to be made up of a low glycemic index carbohydrate, aiming for a quarter of the plate to be made up of a nice lean protein, so that could be of the animal variety, lean meat, skinless chicken or fish, or it could be lentils and legumes or tofu, for example, if you're going for a vegetarian option, and then a half or 50% of the plate to be made up of your non-starchy vegetables or salad. And that should be giving you a nice balanced nutritional meal. Okay. So how to manage healthy foods that do cause a large meal rise, keeping in mind that I don't want the solution to be cutting the carbohydrates out, but rather how can we manipulate that meal to better suit yourself or your family, to that you can still enjoy the same healthy meals and a nutritious balanced diet without having to cut foods entirely. So some strategies that you can use: you can add in some protein, for example lean meats, low fat dairy, legumes and lentils, things like beans and chickpeas. You can add in an unsaturated fatty acid source, so like I mentioned earlier, nuts, seeds, avocados, chia seeds is another good example there. You could also add in some fibre, in particular soluble fibre. You've got legumes, lentils, oats, fruits and vegetables as well, which will assist with all of that. When there's a higher fibre content, it helps to lower the glycemic index of a meal. Okay, so how to manage healthy foods causing large meal rises, another slide but with more specific examples. So for example, at breakfast time with your breakfast cereal, you could add in some almonds or some other nuts. That's adding in that element of protein and also unsaturated fats as well. You've got LSA mix, which stands for linseed, sunflower and almond. You can either make it at home if you have a good mix master, or you can buy it at the supermarket as well or from health food stores. Adding in some psyllium husks. In particular, this is a good one because it's that soluble fibre factor. Also adding in some unsweetened yogurt, which once again is adding in some fat and protein there. With bread, toast or crackers, you could try adding some eggs, some avocado, baked beans, some hummus, some tuna, salmon, sardines. So it's adding in that extra layer, which in actual fact is going to be really helpful because it then adds in another macronutrient or major nutrient and gives you that really nice balanced meal as well. Okay, moving on to some more hot meals. You've got soups and tomato-based pasta sauces. So obviously I don't expect you, if you're having something like a pasta meal or spaghetti bolognese or even a lasagna, I don't expect you to be separating out the protein from the carbohydrate and the non-carbohydrate foods on the plate as was previously depicted, but rather to think about it in your mind, how would that mixed meal be made up of. So you can add in some some extra legumes and lentils. You can add in some extra vegetables, whether they be whole, whether they be grated or blended, to make up that mixed meal of half being made up of vegetables or non-carbohydrate vegetables or salad foods, a quarter protein and a quarter low GI carb. With home-baked goods, you could try adding some oats, it's that soluble fibre factor again, adding some fruits and vegetables, even try replacing part of the wheat flour with chickpea flour or almond meal to change that glycaemic index and therefore the glycemic load as well. Okay, so both the pump upload and the sensor trays here are showing a significant rise in blood glucose levels after dinner time. So you can see that you've got a 15.4 blood glucose level, 15.9, 13, 12.6 down the bottom, and at the very top right, 12.8, which is just sitting outside of that circle. Now, on the CGM sensor down the bottom, on the sensor data, you'll see an orange or red line from about, here we go, if you can see my mouse pointer, coming up here at about 8 o'clock and then just going high and pretty much staying high until at least midnight then. So what I want you to have a think about are what are some reasons that this may be happening, or what could actually be causing this. So, the types of foods that can cause meal rises or excursions from target values are high fibre foods like oats and legumes, large serves of low GI pastas and rices, so it's talking about that total carbohydrate load, creamy or cheesy dishes, pasta or rice, and one of the reasons that this happens is because when we have a high fat food, it actually delays the emptying of food from the gut, or from the stomach I should say specifically, and therefore it takes a longer time to process the carbohydrates after that meal. So if you think about it as being like a bottleneck, and we can only go as quickly as as quickly as our body will move. So if we've got a much larger carbohydrate load that needs to be processed, you're going to have blood glucose levels rising for a lot longer period of time. Fast foods, pastries, curries and other Asian style meals, and also rich desserts as well. Okay, so this slide is actually as a result of a study that was done here at Perth Princess Margaret Hospital before we moved to Perth Children's Hospital, and also together with John Hunter Children's Hospital in Newcastle. So the zero line that you can see, if I can get my pointer up just here, is the baseline blood glucose level, and the glucose excursion shows how many millimoles the blood glucose levels are increased on average after meal consumption. So you've got 4 different meals. You've got a low fat, low protein, a low fat, high protein, a high fat, low protein, and a high fat, high protein. So the control low protein, low fat meal, so the red just here, comes back to baseline, but only at 3 hours. So you can see what the delayed impact of a high-fat meal, which is the black line, can actually have in the low blood glucose levels soon after a meal. However, this effect disappears when you add the protein to the high-fat meal. So that's the green. You can see the difference between the green and the black just from adding in, from changing the protein content there. So the higher protein meal and the high fat meal do not return to baseline until 5 hours post-meal consumption. And the high fat, high protein meal still remains high at 5 hours post-meal consumption. So I appreciate that might look a little bit confusing, but the take-home message is that we do need to potentially take more insulin, or to change the way that the insulin is being delivered and the timing of the insulin based on how high the protein and the fat content is in the meal. Okay, so having a look at this particular picture here, what you can see is happening is that the dotted line, the blood glucose levels, are actually having a little bit of a drop before the digestion of the carbohydrates is complete, and that's because the insulin starts to the insulin action starts to occur. So you have your meal bolus and the insulin starts to occur before the carbohydrate digestion is complete. Therefore you get a low blood glucose levels, a hypo, before you then get quite a high delayed meal rise, because the timing has essentially just been mismatched. All right, let me just check I haven't missed anything. Yes, so as I said earlier, when there's meals that sit outside of the norm of the meals that we normally eat, perhaps they're higher in fibre or they're lower in glycaemic index, perhaps they have a higher fat or a higher protein content, anything that's going to manipulate the timing of when our digestion and absorption or our general carbohydrate metabolism takes place, and the impact that that has on our blood glucose levels will therefore have a flow-on effect with the insulin. In this case, the insulin starts to work, and when it peaks at about an hour, hour and a half, that's mismatched when the blood glucose levels are peaking, and if they miss each other, then you're going to get that delayed meal rise there. So some foods are actually going to be better covered with either a dual wave or a combo bolus, which I'll talk about in just 1 second. So just now actually. So what you can see, managing meal-related hyper and hypoglycemia. So the letter A there, that vertical bar, what you can see, that's a normal bolus. The insulin is released in generally in one go, and then the blood glucose levels are managed and ideally come back into range, and that bolus covers whatever carbohydrates that person is eating, and the blood glucose levels are back within target between 2 to 3 hours after eating a meal. However, if you are eating one of those meals whereby the food has a very high or a delayed meal rise, it might be better off that you use a square wave bolus, for example, whereby less insulin is delivered. The insulin is delivered over a longer period of time to manage that delay in the meal rise there. You've also got the basal rate running in the background there as well. What you can also do, is you could do a dual wave, whereby you would release, you would give a little bit of an insulin bolus at the beginning, so say 40% of the total meal bolus, and then 60% might be delivered over a period of 3 or more hours, depending on what that person is eating, and then that will cover any issues you might have with the meal rises, but also managing that initial hypo followed by hyperglycemia. So some terminology for each pump. The AccuCheck Spirit combo is called a multi-wave bolus. The Medtronic 640 and 670G is called a dual wave bolus. The Tandem T-Slim is called an extended bolus. The Ipso pump is called an extended bolus as well. So we're talking about similar sorts of concepts here, but when you're actually looking for the different bolus names, these are the ones that you'll refer to in your pump. Okay, so how to identify which meals are going to give us these meal rises or delayed meal rises? So first things first, back to basics. Ensure you're doing accurate carbohydrate counting, and this is really important because if the basic principles are off, then we can't expect anything else to play out as we would like it to be in an ideal scenario. So once again, aiming for within 10 grams accuracy with most children and adolescents, but if you're roughly 5 years or under, really aiming for within 5 grams, because 10 grams, 15 grams, 20 grams and up there can make a big difference to the blood glucose levels and time in range and meal rises as well. All right, ensuring accurate insulin to carbohydrate ratio and making sure sure that this is correct. So Lara, our diabetes nurse educator, should have demonstrated that earlier today. If you need some extra assistance on this, please just call the triage line and we can talk to you about that. So as people have a growth spurt, we do find that the insulin to carbohydrate ratio will certainly change, and in particular with peak growth velocity periods and also adolescence, those hormones can make the insulin a little bit resistant as well. Reviewing blood glucose levels after meals, so that you may think are a problem. So it might be that you need to do either a finger prick or check your CGM at 3 hours, 5 hours and 7 hours after eating a particular food that you have known to be a bit of a culprit after eating it a couple of times. So pizza tends to be a common one that comes up, and also big pasta meals as well, so that you can learn how to best manage and manipulate the insulin with those particular meals so that you're able to still eat the meals. Keeping a record of the types of foods you ate and the effect that they actually had on those blood glucose levels. All right. Low GI versus high-fat protein foods. So low GI aiming to give about 50% immediately of the insulin dose and 50% over 2 hours. Now, if it's a high-fat protein meal, you might give 60% immediately. High-fat or high-protein, or high-fat and high-protein, you might give 60% immediately and 40% over 3 hours, let's say. So if blood glucose levels still remain high, the research is now showing that you may need to add additional insulin for the meals with high amounts of both fat and or protein. So what we want you to do first is make sure that you've got the fundamentals sorted. So just going back, make sure your carbohydrate counting is correct. Make sure that your insulin to carbohydrate ratio is correct. And then you can try the where are we? The different boluses, the different waves. And if that then still fails, you can add in an additional amount of insulin. So between 20 to 40% more insulin may be required using the following feature. However, keep in mind this would need to be manually added to the food portion of your bolus. So we don't want to be changing that basal at all there. Now, if blood glucose levels after all of these strategies are still high, that's when we want you to come and talk to the team. So call the triage line, you can talk to the diabetes nurse educators, you can also talk to the dietitians to assist with some of these issues that you might be having. It might be that we need to look at a further increase in insulin if required, or an alternate split. So 70% and 30% or something like that. But first try everything else before getting to this point, and call us before you do any significant amendments there as well, to make sure that you're doing it safely. And as always, be sure to keep a record and monitor your blood glucose levels. So, in summary, meal rises can be affected by the correct amount of insulin amount for the food, so making sure that the accurate carbohydrate that there is accurate carbohydrate counting, and also that there is a correct insulin to carbohydrate ratio. Making sure that the timing and also the delivery of the insulin, it might be that all other factors are perfectly on point, but if the insulin delivery, like in one of the slides from towards the beginning of the session, was given after the person already started to eat, you'll find that there's a mismatch with the peak of the insulin and when the blood glucose levels are also peaking, and therefore we would expect a meal rise, or that blood glucose levels in general won't come back to within target within 2 to 3 hours. Something as simple as timing of insulin delivery. We spoke about glycaemic index, glycemic load as an additional factor to have in consideration, and also the presence of fat and protein. Okay. And that one I'm just going to move on from, but it basically is just showing you a square wave bolus and what that might look like. All right, so thank you for listening in today, and as I mentioned earlier, if you do have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to call the triage line, and we can assist you with managing those blood glucose levels. All right, take care.